Don't mind the sound of the blaster and the hone going, but this is like the third or fourth time I put this intake back on. I thought I was chasing intake leak problems, but last night Chris and I ran this with a carburetor. And we used the crank and cam signal to run the coils because I thought I had just a general injection problem, something to do with Hull EFI. So to prove it, we went back to carburetor and distributor. Motor ran fine. And as a half step, we put the cam sync back in the decarbureted manifold with a crank trigger and just ran the coils with the ignition side of it, even though the engine was still carbureted. So now that worked. It's time to put this manifold back on. Chad and I decided to go to the 1/8 inch thick gaskets. It just seems like the port alignment was just a little bit happier with the 1/8 inch instead of like the 60 thou. So I'm gonna put this whole thing back together and try it again. Here's where we're at now. Day 45 of fighting with this intake. Made a couple of good pulls. And I spent a bunch of time in this rat's nest of wiring. I got just a dyno it here. This is the ignition plug, and this wire here runs out to the crank, you know, the flying magnet stuff. And I was just using a 3-wire harness that I had made for something else, which just had power, signal, and ground in it, but no shield. So I had a open box ignition harness here from an unterminated setup, and I actually took the time to wire it in and put the shield wire to the A14, I believe it is, IPU ground pin in here. So now it's a shielded wire grounded on one end out to the crank sensor, and started up and idled okay. As soon as I brought up any RPM, I lost sync, lost RPM signal. So after wanting to burn this thing to the ground, we just said, hey, maybe it has more to do with the cam sensor and the fact it is also an unshielded setup, just 3 wires without any other, you know, 4th wire in there to act as a shield. I had it all zip tied, you know, like this. Get everything neat, get away from the flywheel. Zip tie all this right here. So the main harness for the injectors here and this cam sensor were all together. So literally unzip tied it and separated the two, which ultimately run together in the same harness back to the ECU. Like I don't understand how separating at this end, I'm not sure if there's emissions through the plug. Like the electrical signal part of this is a bit over my head. I started as a car guy, not as a sound engineer. Like I really did this backwards for being good at EFI. So separated the 2 wires from each other, injector harness versus cam sensor harness, and runs like a top. So I'll make a couple of pulls so you can hear what this thing sounds like and get the NA portion of this finished up so I can get the Torqstorm stuff on there and go to town. Here we go. 671.5, 630 torque. And it comes in 570-ish. Has a dip, which this intake runner is very short, but I mean, we're all done by 5,800 is the, peak on this thing, but this cam is not made for NA, it's made for a pair of superchargers, so I guess we'll have to see what happens when we get the boost to it, but carbureted, this thing only made 604 was like the best one. And I'm glad to see such an increase with such a badass intake, so love it. I just turned the lights off in here. I think it'll help you guys see the screen, but here's a data log of that last pull at 671. Green line's throttle position, red line's RPM. For some reason I got coolant temp on there. Let's put timing and closed loop compensation. So turn the scales off. Probably don't need boost because I don't have any right now. So see the green, my throttle position comes up to 100%. And oops, I need some views here. I'm adding 14% right away, which is not good. I'm targeting about 12.8, and it's Holly's saving me. It's adding the fuel, still adding 10% at 4,000, and then it starts dropping off. I must have the map finally coming into it. Now it's pulling 7%, pulling 4%, 3%. Timing's about 32.8, 33. It's adding more fuel, so my map's a bit light for even 12.8, which is what like, you know, the LS stuff I do seems to love 12.8. But this being a big block and what I've seen before, I'm going to try adding some fuel to it, leaving the timing about the same. And by add fuel, I mean make the target richer and add my base map, so it's pulling fuel instead of adding fuel with the closed loop. And then we're going to give another one. Well, it turns out my changes lost power, so I'm going to turn off the... So what I just did, 665, 627 with the same timing and 2 points richer, 12.8 to 12.6 on the air fuel with added and fuel in the map, whereas the one I made just before that was 671 and 630. So any good dyno operator starts with a good engine and slowly makes it worse and worse. That's how I do it here. So I'm gonna go back to my previous tune-up and call that good on the NA portion. Time to get some blowers on this thing, and my goodness, I better make 4 digits or time to start that taco truck.